The champagne glasses were still clinking when Marcus Voss ripped the bank statement from his coat pocket and slammed it onto the marble kitchen island, his voice cutting through the penthouse like a blade, and in that single frozen second, nobody in the room could have guessed that the woman he was about to destroy in front of his glittering guests was the only person who had ever truly loved him without asking for anything in return. If this story moves something in you, if you believe people deserve second chances even when the world has already judged them, hit like, drop a comment, share this with someone who needs it, and subscribe to Shadow Boss Tales so you never miss a story like this one. And before we go further, tell me in the comments, where are you watching from tonight? I read every single one. The penthouse on the 62nd floor of Manhattan's Aurelian Tower was the kind of place people photographed for magazines, all marble and gold trim and a chandelier that dripped crystal like frozen rain. Marcus Voss had built his fortune from nothing, or so he told everyone at every party, though the truth was messier and buried deeper than his tailored suits could hide. Tonight was his engagement celebration, 3 months into a whirlwind romance with a woman named Vanessa Cray, and the room was full of people who smiled at him because of what he owned, not who he was. Standing quietly near the kitchen doorway, almost invisible in her black uniform with the white lace collar, was Rosa Delgado. She had worked for Marcus for 6 years, long before the money multiplied, long before the penthouse, back when he was renting a modest 2-bedroom and could barely make payroll for his tiny startup. Rosa had stayed through all of it. She ironed his shirts before sunrise, cooked meals he barely thanked her for, and quietly covered for him more times than he would ever admit, including the terrible year his mother died and he could not get out of bed for 2 weeks straight. Rosa had a son, Matteo, 7 years old, whose photograph she kept tucked into her apron pocket every single day because she missed him during her long shifts, and because looking at his gap-toothed smile reminded her why she endured the exhaustion, the disrespect, the invisibility. That night, something had gone wrong. Marcus had received a call from his private bank an hour before the party, informing him that a significant account had been frozen due to a suspicious series of withdrawals traced back to household staff credentials. Rage boiled in him instantly, the kind of rage rich men feel when they sense control slipping through their fingers, and rather than waiting for facts, rather than pulling Rosa aside privately, he decided to make an example of her in front of his guests, because humiliation, to a man like Marcus, felt like power. He strode into the living room holding the printed statement, the words account closed stamped in red across the top, and he called Rosa's name so sharply that 3 women near the bar gasped and covered their mouths. Rosa walked toward him, still clutching Matteo's photograph against her chest out of habit, out of comfort, having no idea what was coming. Marcus held up the paper and accused her, loudly, coldly, in front of Vanessa, in front of business partners, in front of people who had never once looked Rosa in the eye, of stealing from him, of betraying the family that had given her a roof and a paycheck. He said words that night he would spend the rest of his life trying to unsay, words about her being ungrateful, about people like her never changing, about how he should have known better than to trust someone who came from nothing. Rosa did not scream. She did not cry, not yet. She stood there in her uniform, in front of the Rolex display box still open on the counter, in front of the Chanel bag some assistant had left carelessly on the marble, and she absorbed every syllable like a woman who had absorbed cruelty before and learned that dignity sometimes means staying silent when your voice would only be used against you. Her hands trembled around the small photograph of her son, and that tiny detail, the way her fingers shook protecting that one picture, was the only sign that anything inside her was breaking. Then Marcus's phone rang. It was his head of security, a man named Julian Farrow, who Marcus rarely spoke to directly because Julian handled the unglamorous parts of wealth, the parts nobody wanted to think about. Marcus answered irritably, still glaring at Rosa, still expecting to hear confirmation of her guilt. Instead, Julian's voice came through shaking with an urgency Marcus had never heard from him before. The withdrawals, Julian said, had not come from Rosa's login credentials at all. They had come from an internal contractor Marcus had hired 2 months earlier, a financial consultant named Desmond Ayres who had been slowly siphoning funds through a shell account, using cloned access codes that happened to route through the household staff system because Marcus, in a moment of convenience months ago, had lazily assigned Rosa's old login to a shared terminal that consultant used for expense reports. The withdrawals were not small. Desmond Ayres had drained nearly $400,000 over 10 weeks, transferring the money into offshore accounts under a series of falsified vendor invoices. And the account frozen tonight, the one Marcus had just humiliated Rosa over in front of his entire engagement party, had been closed automatically by the bank's fraud detection system, not because of anything Rosa touched, but because Ayres had triggered a security flag trying to move another large sum only hours earlier. Marcus felt the blood drain from his face in real time. Every head in the room, still turned toward Rosa in judgment moments earlier, now turned to him instead. The silence that followed was worse than any accusation he had thrown, because in that silence, everyone understood exactly what he had done. He had taken the most vulnerable person in the room, a woman who had given him 6 years of quiet loyalty, and torn her apart publicly based on nothing but assumption and the arrogance of a man who believed his money made him infallible. Vanessa, his fiancée, was the first to step back from him, her expression shifting from confusion to something closer to disgust. She looked at Rosa, then at Marcus, then quietly set down her champagne glass on the counter beside the open Rolex box, as though the jewelry itself had suddenly lost its meaning. The two women who had gasped earlier now would not meet Marcus's eyes at all. Marcus turned to Rosa, and for the first time all evening, he actually looked at her, not through her, not past her, but at her, the way you look at someone when shame finally forces your eyes open. Rosa's cheeks were wet now, silent tears she had held back through the accusation finally slipping free, not from anger, but from the sheer exhaustion of being disposable in the eyes of a man she had protected for years. She did not gloat. She did not throw the moment back in his face the way many would have, the way perhaps he deserved. She simply asked, in a voice barely above a whisper, whether she could go home to her son, because Mateo's babysitter had texted twice already and she did not want him waking up alone. That single sentence, so small, so human, so devoid of malice even after everything, undid something in Marcus that 6 years of watching her work quietly around him had never managed to reach. He realized, standing there in his $5,000 suit surrounded by people who had already begun quietly leaving, that Rosa Delgado had a son waiting for her, a whole life outside the walls of his penthouse, worries and love and exhaustion that had nothing to do with him, and he had never once asked about any of it in 6 years. He had let a stranger's photograph, tucked into an apron pocket, be the only piece of Rosa's real life he had ever glimpsed, and even that he had ignored until this very moment. The following days were the hardest of Marcus's adult life, not because his business faced consequences, though Desmond Ayres was arrested within the week and the stolen funds were partially recovered through the bank's fraud investigation, but because Marcus could not stop replaying Rosa's face in that room. He tried calling her. She did not answer. He drove to the modest apartment building where she lived with Mateo, a place with peeling paint and a broken elevator, nothing like the marble towers he was used to, and he stood outside for 20 minutes before he found the courage to knock. Rosa opened the door only partway, Mateo peeking curiously from behind her legs, his gap-toothed smile from the photograph now visible in real life, wary but curious about the tall stranger standing awkwardly in the hallway. Marcus did not launch into excuses. He did not offer money as a bandage, which was the only language he had ever truly spoken fluently. Instead, he said he was sorry, plainly, without qualifiers, and admitted that he had let power make him cruel, and that no apology could undo what he had done to her in front of a room full of people who mattered to him but clearly should not have mattered as much as they did. He told her that watching her ask permission to go home to her son had taught him more about decency in 10 seconds than his entire life of accumulating wealth ever had. Rosa listened without interrupting, her arms crossed, her guard still fully up, because words are cheap when they come after the damage. But something in his voice, stripped of its usual command and certainty, made her finally speak. She told him that she had cried in the elevator that night, not because of the accusation itself, though it had cut deep, but because for one terrible moment she believed all 6 years of her work had meant nothing to him, that she had simply been furniture that occasionally required scolding. She said the hardest part was not the humiliation. It was the loneliness of realizing that a man she had quietly cared about, in the complicated way people care about those they serve, had never once considered that she might be worth defending. Marcus asked her to come back, not as an employee this time, but as someone he wanted to actually know, someone whose son's name he wanted to learn properly instead of glimpsing in a stolen photograph. He offered to pay for Matteo's school fees, to fix the broken elevator in her building himself, to do anything that would begin repairing what he had broken. Rosa, wiser than her circumstances ever gave her credit for, told him that she did not need his money to feel whole again. She needed him to become someone who would never again mistake silence for weakness, someone who understood that the people who serve you quietly are often the ones holding the most dignity in the room. Over the following months, Marcus changed in ways his old business partners barely recognized. He ended his engagement to Vanessa, not out of spite, but because her reaction that night, however understandable, revealed a partnership built on appearances rather than character, and he no longer wanted a life built that way. He rehired Rosa on his own terms this time, terms she set, with fair wages, real respect, and a standing invitation for Matteo to visit the penthouse on weekends, where the boy discovered he loved the enormous window overlooking the city lights and Marcus discovered he loved watching a child's wonder more than any acquisition he had ever made. He also began quietly funding scholarships for children of household staff across several properties he owned, inspired entirely by a boy's gap-toothed smile and a mother's silent tears in a marble kitchen. He never spoke publicly about that engagement party, never tried to spin it into a redemption story for cameras, because he understood, finally, that real change does not need an audience to be real. If this story touched something in you tonight, if it reminded you that dignity cannot be bought and that the quietest people in the room often carry the heaviest hearts, please take a moment to like this video and share it with someone who needs a little hope today. Your comments mean the world to this channel, so before you go, tell me honestly, have you ever misjudged someone the way Marcus misjudged Rosa, and what did you learn from it? I read every single comment, and I would love to hear your story. Rosa Delgado never became wealthy in the way Marcus was wealthy. She still worked, still came home tired most evenings, still worried about bills the way she always had. But something had shifted permanently in the space between her and the man she worked for, a mutual recognition that had been missing for 6 long years. Matteo grew up knowing his mother had once been humiliated in front of strangers and had walked out with her head held high anyway, and he grew up watching a rich man learn, slowly and imperfectly, what it actually meant to be decent. And perhaps that is the real ending worth remembering, not a fairy tale where poverty transforms into riches, but a quieter truth, that the people who kneel to serve us are never beneath us, that cruelty dressed as authority always eventually turns pale in the mirror, and that sometimes the greatest fortune a man can find is not in his bank account, but in finally learning to see the people he had spent years looking straight through. Thank you for watching until the very end. If you believe stories like this one deserve to reach more hearts, please subscribe to Shadow Boss Tales, share this with a friend or family member who needs a reminder about kindness today, and leave a comment below telling us where in the world you are watching from. We will see you in the next story.